Please join me now in reciting our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another.
Recognizing there is human suffering all over this world in the course of natural and human catastrophes. We ring our gong this morning in honor of 3 such places of suffering and struggle. We ring our gong first, as we have since July of 2019, in honor of the 7 children who have lost their lives in federal custody in our detention camps. And we let its ringing stand symbolically for those adults who have also lost their lives in these camps, those who remain in them, many separated from their families and many now infected by COVID-19 or at great risk of infection. We ring our gong additionally once for the losses this week to COVID-19, the virus whose symptoms we know by heart, and that has affected us all. This week, 44,437 people died of COVID-19 globally, and 5,794 died from the virus in the United States alone. We hold in our hearts all of these losses, and all whose recovery from the virus is slow and uncertain, all who continue to risk their lives to provide essential services, who've lost a job and suffer from economic uncertainty, those who are at particular vulnerability to the infection, and everyone who struggles increasingly with isolation and grief and loneliness the longer the pandemic continues. Finally, we ring our gong once also. This Sunday, for all those Native and Indigenous, GLBTQ and other, all whose humanity in all its fullness has been disregarded, all whose lives have been threatened or lost, forced into barren landscapes, both literal and those of the mind and the heart and the spirit. for all their suffering and the collective loss to us all. Because of this legacy, we ring our gong. So much to remember and to hold. So may we keep those we have named and their loved ones in our thoughts and in our continued prayers. And may we ease the tide of human suffering this coming week, howsoever we can.
Reverend Tet Giardo describes prayer as an articulated common dream. So I invite you to join me in that spirit, in naming a dream together. Spirit of life, abiding love beyond our naming, we come together this Sunday and every Sunday, a people with a vision made up of many visions, with shared longing for a world that fully honors every single person, that fully values the interdependent whole. In the midst of turbulence and disorienting uncertainty, in a time where we can find ourselves constantly reacting, jumping from crisis to crisis, we take this moment to pause. Spirit of life, open our hearts, widen our view. Help us to perceive anew that which has been rendered invisible, that which is hard to see, much less to feel. Deepen our ability to hold that complexity, the discomforting weight of truth, and let discomfort lead us not into shame or despair, but into a renewed commitment. May we remember our way forward. As we remember, we hold space for those whose stories have been lost to history, covered over or willfully omitted, those whose stories have been muted, distorted, or suppressed. We hold space for everyone in our community and beyond, for whom the simple act of being oneself has sometimes been contested. We hold space for any for whom being fully known remains a struggle. May we ground in the gifts of our distinctiveness, honoring the multitudes within each one of us, inviting each one of us to be full and complex and beautiful as we are, knowing that from this place the whole can be more full and complex and beautiful too. May we create together a world where everyone can belong, where no one need make themselves smaller, less vibrant, or less true to their core, where every single person can be witnessed, known, and loved, where our fundamental interdependence is more deeply felt and our mutual thriving more fully realized. For this and the silent prayers in our hearts this morning, in this silence we pray. May our dreaming, alone and together, bring some solace in times of heartbreak and be a compass that may guide our way forward. May it be so.
Ourselves.
This we know. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. This we know. We did not weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it. This we know. Another thing we know now is that those beautiful words that our soloists just performed, words that for years have been attributed to a famous 1854 speech by Chief Seattle, a historic indigenous leader from the Pacific Northwest. Those words were, in fact, written by a screenwriter named Ted Perry. Perry's words, made famous by a TV movie in the 70s, have since made their way into books and onto environmental blogs. They've inspired sermons and formed the basis for children's books. They're even found on t-shirts and bumper stickers, and of course in songs, like the one we just heard. Consistently, they're attributed to Chief Seattle, an anglicization of Chief Siach. There's a decent amount of scholarship that traces how this widespread misconception came to be. Chief Siach did give a passionate speech in 1854, responding to pressure for his people to cede their land to the U.S. government. One of the eyewitnesses that day, a poet and doctor named Henry Smith, did take notes, but Smith's grasp on Chief Siach's native Lushootseed was a little less than perfect. He'd only been with the Duwamish people for about a year, and he didn't write up his notes for another 33 years. Several adaptations emerged from Smith's version, changing a bit each time, like a game of telephone. And finally, one of those was the inspiration for Perry, who penned a rousing environmental appeal for his version of Chief Seattle to offer in a film. The speech, then stripped of its attribution to Perry by the producer, who wished it to have the illusion of greater authenticity. And the real Chief Siach starts to vanish behind white people's use of him. There wasn't malice or conspiracy in this, a creative liberty, a little exaggeration, a consistent neglect of sourcing. But this chain of seemingly innocuous decisions, situated in unchecked bias and devoid of critical context, together proved painfully consequential, reducing a historic indigenous leader to a cinematic caricature. It's not a pattern we want to repeat. There's no doubt that the picture of Chief Seattle painted in Ted Perry's speech is an appealing one. The very ubiquity of these words speaks, I think, to some kind of collective longing for a grounded, prophetic voice on behalf of our planet, some older wisdom that could carry us through this time of climate disruption. It hints, too, at the appeal of a visionary indigenous leader, maybe even an unspoken desire to know and to mourn for what we all know or suspect was lost in the brutal genocide of the indigenous peoples of these lands. All of this brings so many good questions to the fore, doesn't it? Just this one example, this one grappling. All of the habits to break, all the questions we need to ask, the levels of accounting our nation will need to do for a truly honest telling, an honest relationship with our past. Rather than putting Chief Siach up on a pedestal, creating some kind of fictionalized account of his life and his words, what if we name what we do know and start there? How Chief Siachu's people were ravaged by smallpox, measles, and other diseases introduced by Europeans in the 80 years after contact. Or the treaty that was signed a year after Siachu's historic 1854 speech, in which his people did cede the land we now know as Seattle over to the US government. Or the larger history this all ties into of the United States' systematic dispossession of peoples from their land. And we know that Chief Siachu's story does not end with that speech, or even with his death in 1866. When you search for the Duwamish people, what you find just below the name of the website that leads you to them are these words in all caps: "We are still here."